Excited to welcome Arizona State Professor Rob Gray, who has been conducting research on teaching and courses related to perceptual motor skill for over 25 years. Rob is host of Perception and Action podcast, perceptionaction.com, and author of How We Learn to Move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sport skills, a must-read book for all coaches. Gray has strongly emphasized the communication and dissemination of scientific knowledge in the Perception and Action podcast and has helped bridge the gap between theory and the field. With over 350 episodes and 2 million downloads, it has become a critical resource for individuals working in areas including coaching, talent development, training, and rehabilitation. There is no doubt his new book as well will join that list. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Big fan. I've listened to your podcast for as long as you've done it. Just tremendous resource especially for a coach like myself to keep up to date on knowledge that I don't have time to necessarily research and read journals, even though I like reading them. But let's talk about the book and the podcast. Why should coaches listen to your podcast, and why should coaches buy your book? Because I think they should.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of really interesting new ideas for how to coach, to design practices, really fundamentally changing the role of the coach. I try to put it in the book from instructor, where I know all the answers, to more of a designer and a guide, where you help an athlete find their own solutions. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting research and ideas out there for how you can add this to your practice. And I really believe there's so many benefits to it, whether you go full bore and dive in like I do, or whether you just make some changes like adding more variability to your practice. It's more fun and engaging, reduces chance of injury. So I think, just at least visiting these ideas and even thinking about why, even if it gets you to think about why you do some of the drills you do and really dive into that, I think it's beneficial.
Well, I love how you come across, and you don't come across as judgmental of coaches. You don't come across, and I try and do the same. I don't say anyone's wrong, but the question is, can we do better? And the answer is yes. So maybe highlight some of the ways where coaches you feel can do better.
Yeah, I really believe that as well. And I consult and I do a little coach education, but I'm not a coach either. So I would have no business saying someone's wrong. But I think we can do better for a few different things, especially, in the practice sessions, getting more interactions between players, taking advantage of, people have so much time to practice at home by themselves now, especially kids. When you have a chance with everybody together, use that chance instead of doing kind of reductionistic drills of, passing and dribbling around cones or something like that. So I think that's advantage. I think, and then there's just so many kind of fun, making things more game-like. I think there's motor learning research shows it's more beneficial for skill development, and it's also more engaging and fun for the athletes. So I think, simple changes. The biggest one is just, kind of making things more game-like by keeping, instead of doing a decomposed dribbling drill, try to do a small-sided game or something like that. And then just adding variability too. Instead of doing a ton of shooting from the corner threes, let's get some posed practice, or shooting, different kind of things. So those are kind of the basics, I would say.
Well, and most of the coaches that listen to the podcast understand some of these things that I've shared as well. And I love that first of all, coaches, if you listen to the podcast and read the book, Rob makes it practical. And that's where a lot of sport researchers, I would say, fails the wrong word. That's too strong. But they don't necessarily connect it in a practical way. And you do such a great job making it practical for us by giving us examples. And obviously, just again, you thinking out loud and sharing that thought with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And the real kind of theme in the book is exploration, right? And I'm still exploring. I don't know all the answers by any means. I'm still exploring these ideas. And that's really what I wanted to accomplish with the book. The book, more so than the podcast, if you kind of dive in at the most recent episode, it's pretty deep into the weeds, right, of the terminology and the technique, because I think I'm on 370 or something by now. But the book is kind of meant of more of a starting point to get you thinking about these different ideas, the importance of variability in movement, and the moving away from the repetition and the one correct way to do things. So that's really what I wanted to try to accomplish with the book, give people an entry point to these ideas.
So going back to what you said before, I frame it as player-led versus coach-led development. And too often we do a disservice as coaches to ourselves when we go into practice and we run drills and do things with players where they could do those on their own. The blocked, isolated dribbling reps, as you referred to already.
Mhm.
They don't need us for that. They need us
Mhm.
to connect perception and decisions with skill. So
Mhm.
talk to us more about that part of it.
Yeah, I think one of the key words you said right there, decisions. Like, almost any team sport, what we want is, we're dying for creative players that can create scoring opportunities by making good decisions. Then you go to practice, and how often do you let an athlete make a decision, right? Usually they're all scripted plays. They know what's going to happen. You tell them where to pass or whether to shoot or not. So letting athletes make decisions, I think, is a really big designing practice where they get lots of opportunities to interact and make decisions, I think, is critical. And yeah, I think, the idea that, the we don't know the right answer as a coach. We can help guide them, and we know some of the things that probably won't work or might cause injury. But, the kind of letting people, the term we use is self-organize. Okay, kind of letting things work out on your own, basically.
Well, and that's hard for coaches, right? Because we're used to
Hmm.
giving this really implicit instruction, and then the players execute that implicit instruction, and
Hmm.
then that is the answer. And what
Hmm.
you're basically saying is that we shouldn't necessarily always coach to our solution, that we should co-create solutions with players. And that is really our role as a coach, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that that's a great co-create is a great word, and co sometimes use co-adaptive. The idea that we're working together as not the old version is you're coming to me as a coach. I have all the answers. I'm just going to tell you. You're a very passive sponge, versus let's work together and try to come up with a solution. And yeah, and the growing, I try to, in the first couple chapters of the book, I try to dispel the idea that there's one correct way to do things, and I think everybody knows this, right? I was talking with someone else, like if I blocked out and just showed you like movement, patterns of different people shooting in basketball, you could probably tell that's Stephen. Oh yeah, that's Stephen Curry. That's it, right?
Yeah.
Without being able to see the face because they're not doing it the same way. There's lots of different ways to shoot. There's lots of different ways to dribble, So the idea that there's one correct way that you get from a coach, I really think we need to move away from that.
So I want to come back to shooting and talk about
Mhm.
that a little bit. But before we do, here's another thing I get all the time is, and maybe I'll get your thoughts on what is holding coaches back from embracing more of these evidence-based ideas. But I share it around this aspect that you've already referred to, which is if I'm a coach, where do I start? Like, where do I start? Even if I now understand and see the value of what you're saying, it's really changing their whole approach in some ways. And they don't have to do it all at once, right?
Mhm. For sure. It is a tough, it's a tough thing. And I totally recognize the pressures on coaches have to get these kind of short term, getting people proficient in the short term. I've actually had coaches tell me that, they try these methods and sometimes the parents complain to them that they seem like they're doing nothing.
I get
What am I
that all
paying
the
you all this
time.
money
Yeah.
for? You're just standing around
Yeah.
letting them play. Yeah. So I think, the start, I think, is just, I'm not saying completely abandon overnight
Mhm.
what's working for you. Just start to think, I think adding the variability, how can I change the conditions a little bit? To get people, shooting from different angles, different positions, different things, and then can I make a game out of this? And I think those are where I would start. And once you kind of get into that, it kind of evolves, I think, for people. But I recognize what I really want to try to get away from, and this is a hard sell for coaches. A lot of coaches, the idea that you have to have the fundamentals before you can play, like the idea you have to dribble a basketball before you can play basketball. I really think that's a fundamentally flawed. It's something we stick to because it's safe and easy, but I really think that's something that's hard for sometimes coaches to move away from.
Especially for youth level coaches, it's really
Mm-hmm.
hard to see that. And it's this case. Do we have to perfect the skill before they use it in a game? And
Mm-hmm.
absolutely not. And honestly, isn't it better to not perfect the skill?
Yeah, I think because to me, it's not really the skill.
Yeah, totally.
The idea that, I always give, the agility, whether it's dribbling a basketball or a soccer ball, it has a purpose, right? It has a purpose. I go left with the ball because you're coming at me to my right, trying to steal it, right? It's a link to the information from the other player and the environment. When I do a decomposed fake drill around cones, or the coach tells you which way to go, then you've removed all functionality. I call that fake agility. It's not really skill to me. It's aesthetics, right? It looks good, but and everybody knows in every sport, some players that are unbelievably technically good at dribbling between their legs and around the back, and then you get them in the game and they're useless because they don't know how to take advantage of space and pass and when to shoot and things like that. Yeah.
So we ultimately, we know this, and I think we intuitively know this. The decision is more important than the skill. But when I say that, people kind of freak out because obviously the skill is such a big part of it. But what we're saying there is that, do we really care what layup they shoot, as opposed do we care that they made the right decision to shoot the layup because they had an open window to be able to shoot the layup?
Yeah. Yeah. The idea is that, if we create practice conditions in which, you need that layup, it will emerge, right? You don't need to give it to you first. And I have this story I love in my book. James Rudd told me he did this where he evaluates fundamental movement skills in kids. And he was trying to get this girl to gallop, kind of run like a horse. And she couldn't do it at all. And eventually he said, "Oh, you did great. Thank you." And he let her go. And then the kids started playing together, and she was playing tag, and she ran down a hill to try to catch someone. And she perfectly did the movement he wanted, the gallop, because it was functional. Then it stopped her from falling, right? So something's functional and it'll emerge. That's the idea. You don't need to give it to people first. If it's important and you need it, like keeping the ball protected when you lay up, you design the drills, the practice conditions, you'll learn that. It'll emerge. Yeah.
A basketball closeout is a great example of that, we overcoach it, and we overcoach it before it ever gets a chance to emerge. And essentially, it's a pretty simple action, isn't it? It's run and stop as fast as you can. And then the rest of it is all based on decisions about how you're covering, who you're covering, where you're forcing the ball. Those are all decisions, but the actual physical action is not that hard. And in your mind, that could emerge naturally if we create the situation.
Yeah, and I think this is where one of the real big approaches in this view, the constraints-led approach, right? That's as a coach, the kind of myth we want to dispel with this too is it's completely hands-off coaching, like the coach doesn't do anything, right? If you have athletes doing something, you have a practice activity and they're doing layups where they're keeping the ball way out to the side that could be easily stolen or something like that. You as a coach, it's still your job to say, okay, that solution is not going to work in the long term in a real game or when they're faster players. So I can create a practice condition that takes that away from them, right? So it's still the job. Your job as a coach is more to guide and push them and mold the solution rather than here is how you do this technique. Now let's play basketball. That's kind of the idea.
Well, and the other idea is that now your interventions as a coach are in the context of the game. And that makes it more powerful, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think going back to that, it's coupled, the word I like, coupled to the information, it's driven by the information. It also makes them more I call it, adaptable versus adjustable, right? If you give someone the technique, I teach you, like the example in golf I use, I teach you how to hit a golf ball off flat ground and practice the stroke over and over again. Then you need to adjust it for downhill lies and uphill lies and sand. Versus if I get you to just play in a bunch of different conditions, you learn to adapt your movement to different constraints rather than learning the one technique that you have to adjust later on. So I think it makes you more flexible, adaptable. You can adapt when your shot, when you get fatigued, right? Your jump shot, when you start to get fatigued, your body, you learn how to make the adjustments that you need.
This is awesome. I love talking about this. And you talked about it will emerge. And there is also a leap of faith for coaches. And we've actually done 2 big presentations in our community for coaches to be able to tell them, how do they know it works? And the simple answer I give to coaches is, we know basketball transfers to basketball. More the question is, how do you know 3-man weave transfers anything, as an example?
Yeah.
So can you address this a little bit in terms of how does a coach know it works?
Yeah, that's a real tough question. And, I recognize that, when we still need kind of good ways to, evaluate in the short term whether we're leading people on the right path. And, I talk about, I think, just having the right components. What we know from transfer, you're right, is you have to have very, very similar conditions for any kind of transfer to happen. And so, I think as a coach, the key, the other point I like to make is, although we're recognizing there's not one correct way to do things, there's individual variation, there are some key features, I sometimes call it invariants, that have to be there, right? So one way that I think you can evaluate, is this going in the right way, is, are those there, right? For a jump shot to be successful, you have to have, there's some, you have to release the ball at a certain angle, there's got to be certain features there. So that's one way that I kind of think of it. And then just, the weave, example again is, very choreographed. That remind, sometimes when I go to practice, I observe practice and then I say, that's a nice dance recital. When does practice start? Not that I'm putting down dance as any being skillful, but no decisions, no unpredictability. Everyone knows exactly what's going to happen. That's not sports, right? That's not
Right.
what's happens in sports.
Well, basketball is not memorization. And
No.
that's your point, right?
Yeah.
It's not memorization. So when we do drills that we prescribe something, they memorize it, they do it, we feel that they're getting better. But the reality is, when you say transfer as well, you mean transfer from practice to competition, which is
exactly
the ultimate test of all this, isn't it?
Yes, for sure. I think, and we want to get you better in the game, and I think there's some interesting ideas too with in the teamwork level, memorization. One of the kind of movements also we're making, I didn't talk about it too much in the book, is this idea from moving from memorizing plays, right, where a coach draws out a play on a board where you do this when this happens, you do that, to what we call shared affordances. So affordances are kind of opportunities for action. So what we want to see is the point guard sees the same thing at the same time as the center does. They both see, the defender left the hoop undefended. The point guard lobs the pass at the same time the center. It's not a scripted play. They just both saw the same opportunity because you gave them practice at picking up opportunities, not just running scripted pass here when this happens plays, right? So that's another big thing we're trying to move to.
So I frame it as structured to unstructured in a sense, because I don't want coaches to kind of think that some of these blocked reps aren't necessary, because they bring comfort and confidence to you as the coach, but also to your players, right? But ultimately, with whatever structure we have, we don't want to stay there. And that's basically it with block practice, right? Block practice isn't wrong, but we don't want to stay there.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that's an important point. I think, we're recognizing, we need to periodize training, skill training, just like we periodize physical training. All of it can't be about skill development and changing, and right, that would be exhausting. And then also right before a big game, you don't want to start, let's work on your 3-point technique, right? That would be not the best idea. So yeah, we can have practices that are more focused on getting confidence, feeling the rate of pressure, which might be more block things. We might have slightly more blocked practice at when we're starting out with a player that's really novice. There's a good I pointed to, Stephen Curry posted a thing on Twitter where he was doing the exact same jump shot from the corner every time passing the ball, and everyone's like, look, block repetitions, how he got good. And then he came out and said, that's what I do before a game, just to kind of get warmed up and feel good. In practice, I do shots from all over the place. I do wind sprints between shooting sessions, so I get fatigued. Like he's adding variability, exactly what we're kind of arguing. Yeah.
Well, totally. And that, I know with Steph's dribbling routine, everyone always points to that. He does 2-ball dribbling. And I'm like, okay, again, he's doing these things for his comfort and confidence prior to the game. And we as coaches should create all those environments or conditions for players to be comfortable before a game, shouldn't we?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think you have to recognize, okay, what's the purpose of this practice session? We just want people to feel comfortable and confident. Then we don't want to have a lot of huge variability and chaos. And that's another point I try to make in the book. Learning is messy. It's about making mistakes, right? When everything if your team perfectly executes every drill you did in practice, a practice session, they didn't learn a single thing, right? Learning requires making mistakes, searching for different solutions. So when you want to really focus on learning and improving a specific thing, then yeah, you need that versus, let's right before the game, let's focus on confidence and things like that.
Talk to us about progressions, because I'm a big believer that the way I grew up with all these progressions, that it actually slowed down and hindered my learning, as opposed to what some people call this hard first instruction, or exposing them at an optimal level to, as you've talked about, like the game condition. Then you can always go backwards, right? And there's more value to that than building up slowly through progression.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits to getting people right in the game, and then whether there's a good example in the book from tennis, right? Kids have the typical progression. You hit the ball that I toss from a short distance, that I move, and it's boring. It doesn't really get to what we want. Instead, we change the equipment. In basketball, we can lower the hoop, get you playing right away, instead of focusing on the fundamentals and trying to build up to the actual game. I agree. I'd much rather get you in the game, and then as a coach, okay, they're not, they have to look down at their hands when they dribble. They're not, let's add a constraint or something to get that behavior out, right? Pull it out, right, as we see it.
Well, I want to get to constraints and dive deeper, because I think that's one of the most important things that you've shared for coaches. The other part of this that you mentioned is boring. And I love that word, because again, like, practice is not always exciting, and we don't pretend that it is. Like, there's these repetitions that are necessary, but when you use this games approach, or whatever you call it, players tend to enjoy it more, don't they? Because they feel that they're more connected to playing the game.
Yeah, I think so. I really do, and I'm biased, obviously,
Of course.
in this, but I work with a lot of coaches that have made this change, and I've had several tell me that as soon as they change this, they can hear the difference. They can hear the difference in how the kids are talking to each other, the excitement, and right. It's more fun. I'm one of the big motivations I had for the book is, I think we're chasing a lot of kids away from developing a love of movement, because of this elite sports model, right? If you can't master dribbling around, this dribbling drill, then kids are like, oh, I'm uncoordinated, I'm not sporty, and they they never pursue anything like that again. They get chased away. Whereas if we made it more fun, and I think we would definitely keep more people in. So yeah, that's a big, I think, for sure.
Well, I think that's a greater conversation that I hope maybe I'll have with you sometime, because I was just thinking and go, how many youth coaches make players, or essentially not make, but they turn players into non-offensive players. Mm-hmm. And essentially, like, if I'm thinking about, I'm an 8 to 12 mini basket player and I never get to play offense, I'm probably not going to be retained in the sport. That's no fun.
No.
And when you play these small-sided games and these decision games, you get offensive reps and defensive reps and two-way coaching reps every single time you're playing, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think the word I like to use is amplify, right? Mm-hmm. We're just, instead of having a full game, you don't get many opportunities sometimes to scoring opportunities, to, especially in things like soccer, but in basketball too. Keeping the court less players in a smaller area, you're constantly, facing other players and having to make decisions and having opportunities to be creative and things like that.
Okay, so let's get into constraints, because I love all this. First of all, let's start on a simple level. What is a constraint? What's a constraint-led approach?
Okay, so the idea is that, if we're going to accept there's not one correct technique, then there's multiple different ways to shoot, right? I could shoot with underhanded, with my left hand, with, from my chest. A constraint. So there's all these different solutions, Bernstein called this the degrees of freedom problem. How do I choose what to do? And constraint is something, the reason we use that word, which sounds kind of weird, is it's something that takes away one of the solutions, right? It takes away and actually pushes you to do another one. So if I put a big barrier in front of you in basketball, then I can't use the solution of an underhand shot. I can't use a low launch angle of the ball. I've a constraint of a barrier in front of me is taking away some of the solutions and getting me to explore other ones. So that's kind of the fundamental idea. And then the idea is there's individual constraints you bring, your height, your flexibility, a short 5 foot, like I can't do certain things that a 6'5" person can do. And then there's task constraints, which is the main thing the coach manipulates. And then there's environmental constraints. What's the surface of the court? Are we playing outdoors in the wind? Things like that.
And to clarify this is only random to the players. The coach knows what they're doing, and that's the idea of the constraints, right? That the coach knows what they're manipulating and what they're trying to shape from the constraint.
Yeah, yes, definitely. The coach has kind of the constraints. One constraint is the number of players, right? So a small-sided game is manipulating that constraint. There's obviously there's some constraints the coach doesn't have control over always, but there are main ones. Yeah, they want to manipulate. And like I said, constraints is purposeful. You add a constraint. If, for example, say you wanted to, as a basketball coach, you wanted to emphasize, pressure on the other team after they get the ball, you could add a constraint. Okay, you get 4 points when you score after a turnover versus 2 when you in regular point. So you can add this constraint. You're not telling them what to do. You're just giving them something to encourage a different kind of pattern, explore different ways to move and different solutions. So that's the key point. Is a constraint is not here's how you do it. It's like something to make you explore different ways of doing it.
Right. So it's not a rule. It's not a must, right? Yes. It's a possibility.
Yes. And another example that I talk a little bit in the book, there's this group in Ireland that developed these things called chin-up goggles. They're basically sports glasses with a little piece of plastic at the bottom, so you can't look. If you want to look down while you're dribbling, you have to put your head down. So you're not, so this is really going to force me to dribble using different information. I'm going to have to start to learn to use proprioceptive information to dribble. I can't dribble by looking at the ball with these things. So it's a constraint. It's taken away the solution of watching the ball while I dribble and making me learn something else.
We're going to go on a quick tangent there with the goggles. So again, I want coaches to understand the goggles, how they benefit maybe to learning how to dribble. But really where the goggles should be used is that you should put them in the small-sided game or in the game with the goggles, because it forces them to be able to have different things emerge, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the idea is it's going to so if I dribble by looking at the ball, with those goggles, I'm going to get the ball. People are going to steal the ball from me every time when I go in a small-sided game, right? Because I'm looking down. I'm not going to see people coming. I'm not going to be able to make good passes. I'm going to have turnovers. So I'm kind of putting pressure on to you to do something else, right? Without telling you what that is. Yeah, that's exactly the idea.
Okay, so talk to us then about the problem with using guidance, because again, it's okay, but if we use it too long, there's a danger to it too, isn't there?
Yeah, you definitely want to, I think, for example, at some point you need to switch back to 5-on-5 in basketball, right?
Regular basketball.
You need to, these constraints and these practice activities are meant to, highlight certain, actions and solutions. But yeah, the athletes need to learn they got to put them into the full thing for sure.
So a lot of coaches have seen like mats that players are learning how to move their feet on this mat prior to a dribble move. They start shoulder width and then they jump out to the side. So they're say too wide and then they drive the ball. So using that mat as an initial emphasis or learning point is fine. But if we're doing it all the time, they don't know how to have it emerge naturally, right?
Yeah, that's another point, kind of a really classic motor learning effect. Things like the mat where it's giving you kind of, we call it extrinsic information you don't naturally get from your own body.
Yes.
And then we can get that in all sports. Like I can measure bat speed with my baseball players and all these things, golf, launch angle and things like that. What we don't want to do is, if you have too much of that, then you start tuning out your own intrinsic feedback, right? Your ability to sense where your feet, how far apart your feet are, right? You have sensors in your muscles and joints that can detect that. And what you need to do is learn to kind of tune into that information. And if we get too much external from a coach or some technology, you're not going to do that. So you're right. You want to balance it out for sure.
So coaches, mats, cones, goggles, tennis balls, pylons, all these things, they're okay, but we got to remove them because they don't play with them in the game, right?
Yeah. You definitely, at some point you got to get to the real thing. And getting, with any kind of coaching method, I found this is one of the hardest things to deal with in my career as kind of a consultant, is getting things, I call it, make them sticky. So we can get you to change your technique the way we want it and get rid of some flaw that we don't like in practice, but then the athlete invariably gets in the game and it comes right back, right? So we do need to work on how to get from, these, when we have these constraints or slightly artificial kind of drills, to how do we make it stick in the game?
And constraints don't have to be a full team, right? We can have different constraints for different players. And I kind of give the example of a buffet, that if I take Rob to the buffet, he can eat anything he wants because he's so good. But certain players can only have two things at the buffet because that's what they can handle now. So can you talk about this individualization as well that can happen with this?
Yeah, I think that's, a good point. Constraints are really purposeful, individual. We're trying to get, so an example that I use a lot. So sometimes I'll work with players, I do some with ice hockey, and you get a player that's they do the same thing every time. They've grown up, maybe they were bigger than all the kids when they were younger. They do try to physically get by someone, and get by their defender by moving them out of the way physically. And when they get to a higher level, that doesn't work anymore, right? Because their other defenders are just as strong. So what you kind of do for that player, I want to take away that for a while in practice, make you do something else, make you get by moving the puck or placement of the puck. So, taking away things. So yeah, you want to kind of shape it and constrain based on where you want that individual athlete to go, right? And what they have. And so, yeah, for sure, we want to customize it.
I can't remember the podcast, but it was like a brilliant podcast that stuck out to me that you did. And I think you talked about soccer, but you talked about some of the dangers of constraints. And I think coaches, again, stick with certain constraints too long, to the point that players learn how to almost cheat. And then it isn't simulating the game. And I'll give you a quick example. Say we do a 3-on-2 drill. We remove a player, so there's more decisions in a sense. So there's an advantage somewhere, and players have to find the advantage. So the first pass, someone has to drive the basketball to the basket. But our constraint is there must be one pass out before it's live. Well, the problem with that now is that a smart defender would know that what don't they have to cover?
Yeah.
They don't have to cover the dribble. So then
Right.
Suddenly we don't have something natural emerging, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a couple of things there. One, yeah, the as much as you can, kind of the rule-based constraints, I think, are less effective. Sometimes it's all you have, versus a physical constraint where there's no option. Because the rule ones, yeah, people come up with very creative ways to get around it, in an artificial way. Yeah, so that's one point. And the other one is, what you really, really want to avoid is somehow designing, practice, and constraining so that people are going to develop a solution that's not going to work once you get back in the full game. The example I always use in baseball practice, hitting off a pitching machine where it's the same speed every time. You can learn to time your swing basically from the sound of the machine, or when it's certain distance away from the chute, I start my swing. That doesn't work at all when pitch speeds are varying and the conditions are varying. So you don't want to develop a solution, create a conditions where they develop a solution that's not going to transfer well, for sure.
That's great. It's
Yeah.
good to know in terms of those things. And I think the other thing about constraints that coaches talk about a lot in basketball is that and I don't know, I'd love to get your thoughts. It's better to give the constraint to the defense, because then that helps offense emerge with more possibilities as opposed to constraining the offense. Is there any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, yeah, I haven't really thought about it. One thing I like to do in that point is actually, you know, in this sounds, you break down this kind of idea that there's defense and offense.
Yeah.
Some of the big innovations, the one I always point to would be, I'm Canadian, so ice hockey. I remember the New Jersey Devils, right, in hockey, in hockey, it used to be, you play offense coming this way, then you're on defense. In the middle of the ice is just when you transition between offense and defense. And the New Jersey Devils invented this thing called the neutral zone trap, where they basically played in the middle and they messed up this category of offense and defense. People didn't know what to do because they were being offensive and defensive at the same time. And they were very, very successful with that. So I think that one thing I would say to that, but I think there can be both. I think you're right. You don't want to be, when you want that creativity and things in offense, whereas, especially in basketball, there's defense, there's more responsibilities than creativity, right? You want players to be in certain positions. You don't want them to creatively run across the court and out of position and block someone. So I think you're right. I think that's a good point is, the amount of variability and things you add to practice kind of have to be proportional to the actual, in your sport, right? I was example, like in sprinting, there's not a lot of variability in the way you run. There's some versus NFL football. NFL running back has to have a lot of variability in how they run. They have to dodge people, change speeds. So you want more variability in practice. So I think the same would apply to offense versus defense, right? You want a bit more structure but I think you can do some of the same things though, for sure.
I loved hearing your thoughts on that and getting a little bit more specific, some of the things in the book, but also I think the things that basketball coaches need to kind of consider a little bit more is that you speak in your book about the importance of creating variability in practice, which you've already talked about. But maybe what are some easy takeaways for basketball coaches looking to do this?
Adding variability, some easy takeaways. Yeah, I think, just, try it. There's not one right answer. Right. I think part of the message from this isn't just an alternative set of drills. Mm-hmm. Right. So try things, okay, let's vary the distances. Also, there can be, there's something to be said for teaching athletes to problem solve. So not all of the things you do in the game have to be variation in the practice, have to be variations that occur in the game. Right. So an example of this is like in soccer, we play this sport futsal with a smaller ball. No one ever introduces a smaller ball in a soccer game, right? So it's a variation. So doing things that maybe wouldn't actually occur in the game at all can be beneficial as well too. So I think having fun with it and just kind of, playing with the shooting drills or whatever kind of thing you're doing, I think is the way that I would go.
And with a shooting drill in specific, and you mentioned shooting before, I mean, we never shoot in a game without prior to shooting making a decision, and that decision based on perception, decision, skill, execution. So when we do all these shooting drills that are void of decisions, it's much harder to transfer that to the game.
Yeah, I think so. I think, there's obviously basketball, like I said, there's obviously there's something to be said for practicing a completely open jump shot because it does occur. I think we just don't, the amount we practice it is not proportional to the amount it actually occurs in the game, right? We need, decisions to get into what space, where I'm going to shoot from. I think you're right, it's really important. With the way we move and is very different depending on when we have to make a decision about what we're going to do versus when it's also, there's a big point that we haven't really touched on, injury prevention, right? Mm-hmm. When do athletes get hurt? It's mostly when they do unplanned movements, right? When they have to cut suddenly, or what do we practice? Mostly in practice, planned movements, right? We're not giving them their body a chance to develop the variability in the movement to adjust to these things, right? So I think that's another big issue too, right? When you know exactly where you're going to shoot from everything, I think it's very different than when you're trying to look for openings and things. So you have to, I think, prepare the body for that as well.
Well, and I was going to come to that, and I'm glad you brought it up, because another part of this is obviously conditioning, that you're conditioning the way the game's played. So, these kind of separate, isolated conditionings maybe become less important as well. But the other part is you're less likely to get injured because you're more engaged and more focused, aren't you, when you're actually playing offense versus defense?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you're right. That's sometimes when people get hurt, when they're not fully there, when they're tired, when they're, when they're recovering from an injury, over focusing. So yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it. And I think, it just makes sense, right? If you're going to jump and you land the exact same way every time, right? You're going to place stress on the exact same body parts every time, versus if you're going to learn to jump and you can add a little variability to it, right? You're distributing the forces more. And there's some great work now showing that, you actually, if you develop practice that encourages this variability, you get reduced the factors for ACL injuries and things like that.
Yeah. And it makes sense to me again, because you're training and preparing for the actual conditions of the game.
Yeah.
You also talk about, by the way, coaches, a huge takeaway when you start listening to Rob and reading his book is just that as coaches, we should be using learning language more. And I feel like instead of calling players in practice, if we call them learners, we talk about adaptability, we talk about some of these things that you talk about so much, that I think we connect players better to it being in a learning environment. And that's already what you talked about, the difference between Steph Curry pregame. He's not trying to learn. He's trying to get comfortable. But practice is different.
Yeah, for sure. And, a classic thing that we teach in motor learning classes always is the difference between performance and learning, right? Performance is looking good, right, in the moment. Learning is being good in the future, right? Getting better in the future. And the two are very different, right? Like I said before, looking good doesn't always make you better in the future. So yeah, I think it's right. One of the things that people complain a lot about in this area, and I tried to do a little bit better job in the book, is the terminology. So, there's a lot of terminology if you dive right in. So I tried to, people probably still think there's a lot when they read my book, but I tried to go a little bit less on that. But I do really think there's benefits. One of the things I've really over the years done is I've seen coaches know a lot of this stuff already. We call it in the research, we call it experiential knowledge, right? But I really think there's a benefit to hanging it on, scaffolding it on top of the theory, by using terms and connecting it with terms and ideas. The analogy sometimes I use is becoming a chef versus using recipes, right? When there's lots of coaches you read about, oh, that sounds like a good drill, but if you don't really understand what each of the ingredients of it doing, you have no way of it changing it, adjusting. But if you're a chef, okay, that butter and oil do the same thing. I can switch them, that kind of thing. So I think that's a really important. I think I really believe, not just because it's my area, I think there's a value to trying to connect with some of the theory, the language of learning sciences, for sure.
Well, and I'd say the other thing circles back to what you said earlier, which is this education part of it helps players, administrators, parents all understand and buy in more. And that's what I've found is I've taken time to be able to explain it to people. For example, if I show up at a camp in the summer and there's 80 kids there, I meet with the parents first and I tell them, listen, if you're used to perfectly organized lines, this is not the place. And I explain why so that they understand, because they're only used to seeing this other version, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great point, getting the buy-in and getting people, and going back to the idea we talked about, the kind of co-adaptive, it's not, you don't have to be mysterious as a coach. You can tell players what you're trying to achieve and, what the goal of these different things are. And the parents, I think you can be, superficial, to be accountable and open about what you're trying to achieve. You might not want to get into too much specifics about what you're doing, because you get people overly focused on their body or with the technique, things like that. But yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. And emphasizing, like we said, how we learn is not going to look great all the time.
That's the point. Yeah. And also to say, listen, we're going to it's going to look like we're playing more basketball. And that's not what you're used to seeing at a camp. It's like you're used to seeing people like one rep, isolated in space and all that stuff. And instead, we're going to play the game and have it emerge through games. So, it's easier said than done, of course.
Yeah, it is. And I recognize we know a lot of us were trying to talk about how we can, and also recognize, as a youth coach, you have to balance winning you're with your team versus the long-term development of your athletes, right? And that affects your player choice, right? From overplaying a player that's better than the rest right now or taller, as opposed to kids that need the time to develop. And so I recognize those are really difficult challenges for the coach. It's easy for me to say to do this and do that, but coaches have to deal with these realities. And you're right. I think being, more upfront and, explaining why, I think is a good way to tackle that for sure.
I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, which is this comes back to how do we know it works? One of the ways is obviously to be able to connect what happens in practice to a game. I encourage all coaches to create a video edit of practice to game clips. And that helps connect to say, hey, this is what we're working on in a game and in practice. And here it is helping you in a game or helping us in a game. Can you talk a little bit more about this video connection and evidence?
Yeah, I think, that's a great lesson. And I think we just had, we do this thing related to my podcast called Journal Clubs, where we get people together. And we were talking about how we use video. The traditional way you use video is corrective. Oh, look at you. You went the wrong way on this play. Whereas I think the way you described is a perfect way. We want to move the ball more. Look at this perfect way you did this in the game and we scored. I think connecting the practice, why we want to do it and seeing an outcome is a great tool for a coach. And even point, look, okay, we missed, not that you made a mistake, but look, there was a gap there that we missed. We could have driven to the hoop here. How can we change or practice to make players more likely to do that kind of thing. So yeah, I think giving kind of feedback and getting, that people are moving in the right direction, showing that they, how, oh, look, you adjusted to this play broke down, but you created something out of nothing, because that's really one of the main benefits of this approach, right, is the adaptability. We're going to see it's not scripted, like you said, play. We're going to see great things emerge in unexpected situations because you have the tool. We're giving you the tools to do that.
It's great stuff. And I want to go just to two of your phrases, I guess, your phrasing. Keep them coupled. Can you share that with us?
Yeah. So that's the idea, kind of back to the cones and the idea that, our perception of is fundamentally coupled with action, right? So I act based on information I get from the environment. Like I said, I go left to get away from you coming to the right, right? So when we, and I'll use soccer as the example, when we get you to dribble around cones, we're getting you to act with no information, right? There's no reason to go left versus right around the cone other than the coach told you, right? There's nothing that's fake, right? So what we like to do instead of getting you to learn to control the ball with cones is have you play tag, right? So I try to control the ball while someone's trying to run up and touch you. What's the difference there is when I go left with the ball, I do so because you're coming at me to touch me from the right, right? My action of the dribbling is functional to get away from you. It's driven by information I pick up from your body to see that you're lunging right. So that's the fundamental idea. As much as we can, keep the actions we want driven by the information, right? Another example is the weave, right? The reason you pass to someone is because the spacing between players, they're open. You see right? When you do a weave, you're kind of removing, it's fake, right? It's fake passing. There's no decisions. It's not driven by the information that actually makes you pass a ball. So that's the idea of that.
Well, and that leads me into the next one, which is this concept of fake unopposed drills and your phrasing, which we can never plug back in.
Yeah, the idea that you can take a skill, break it apart into, hitting off a tee in baseball practice or dribbling around cones, and then put it back into where it's in the game and it's driven by information, I think is fundamentally flawed, right? I think that's the like I said, the example of the kid that can dribble between their legs and around their back and do a million things, and then you get them in the game and they don't know how to get around someone, or that's it's an aesthetic versus an actual skill. I think you can't, just because you can do these things, and there's, like we said before, that the transfer is so specific, and one of the examples I love and I give in the book is is my favorite is Albert Pujols, the baseball player, when he was an all-star, tried to hit off Jenny Finch, who was a softball pitcher. And softball, the only difference, it's a little closer and the ball's bigger. He could not put the bat on the ball, right? How did his technique of hitting not transfer to softball? He'd been practicing forever because of the change. It's different. It's different information. These little differences matter, right? So the idea that we can create this fake environment where you learn something and then plug it back in, I think it is flawed.
I love that example. Yeah. That's such a great example to be able to drive that home. And, you know, a lot of coaches can relate to this in golf, right? If you're hitting on the driving range repeatedly with your driver over and over again, you feel pretty good about your driver, but it doesn't always connect the same when you go and play on. And wait a minute, I was just hitting my driver so well, but now the conditions are completely different when you actually play a round of golf.
Yeah, I talked about this. I put a post on Twitter about this. I was thinking about it. The idea we have in a lot of sports is that, you know, technique, whether it's your shooting technique, your 3-point or golf swing, is like this fragile glass vase, right? Once we get it down, we don't want to do anything to mess with our rhythm, our timing, or to mess it up. So we want to keep it safe. And to me, that's a recipe for it to smash into pieces, right? What you really want to do in practice is try to mess it up, right? We were like a lot of golf players know how to do weird, they'll deliberately try to hit it off the toe, right? They'll deliberately try to do something funny with their swing that, you know, mess it up in practice. So I think the same with basketball shooting. You know, I think this idea of trying to keep everything safe, and once we get it down, we have to always do that way, is the wrong way to think about it. Getting it adaptable so you can actually, you know, make even deliberately do something wrong or funny, I think can be beneficial.
I love this. And if you want to think about it this way, like someone phrased it to me as like, so an expert in free throw shooting should be able to miss wherever they want.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not about making it, because there's a lot of actual variability with making it. It's actually, can you miss exactly where you want?
Yeah. Could I bounce it off the back of the rim so it came back to me on purpose over and over again?
Can I hit the right corner of the rim?
Yeah.
And, you know, like,
and you know, and so I put can I put extra spin on it? You know, we think, you know, you don't want to mess with your free throw technique once you get it down, but you know, there's a lot of evidence to show that even like when a player has sort of, you know, flaw when they're in their technique, maybe they shoot it too high. Sometimes even the best thing to do is even exaggerate that, get them to do it even more, because it gives them awareness of kind of some of the things going on. So yeah, I think that's a great example.
Oh, you just hit on something. Can you talk about that, exaggeration in teaching? Because I find it so important in sport to get players to sometimes understand what you actually want them to do is to exaggerate sometimes, you know, what they are doing or what they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, I think, you know, that we have lots of it. I give lots of examples in the book. You know, I work in baseball a lot. Sometimes you have pitchers that kind of they don't quite land square on their foot, which, you know, over the long term could cause knee injuries. So what we do is we take them into sand, put them in a sandbox. And when they land like that, now they almost fall over. So we've exaggerated the error. It kind of makes people not consciously aware of it, but aware of it. And you kind of correct around that. And there's been a bunch of studies, you know, with golf, where you instead of actually giving them the instruction that would correct it, if you actually exaggerate it, you get more awareness and your body figures out how to solve the problem. So this kind of, we call it method of amplification of error, right? It seems to be beneficial. It's giving your body more information about the kind of the solution space, you know, so, you know, I think one of the fundamental ideas, what we want to do is learn and practice the relationship between movement of my body and the outcomes in the world, right? You know, I think, like you said, with a free throw, learning how to, not consciously, what muscle activity produces a shot that goes off the left side of the rim is valuable, right? You're learning this, how your body creates action outcomes. Well, even if it's the wrong one, that learning that relationship is super valuable. I think it makes you know how to solve problems, you know, learning how to get the jump shot in the middle of the hoop when I'm tired, or I need to lean back more because there's someone in my face, right? I think that's really, really valuable to an athlete.
Well, and especially if we think about layups, like the variability on layups relative to like we sometimes with these on-air layups, like really the only decision is based on my location to the rim.
Hmm.
But suddenly we add one defender, and now I've got this perception action relative to the one defender before I even look at the rim. So we
Right.
need to create that variability to simulate again the environment and the decisions that happen prior to the skill.
Yeah, for sure. And there's some great basketball work I talk about by the group in the Netherlands looking at shooting technique, using kind of occlusion to get people to make kind of pick up late information. I think that's a good example. Layups are a good example too of you. Sometimes you need to like drive through the thing, and then at the last, you have to pick up the hoop the last minute, and you need to kind of adjust then versus seeing it 12 steps before, in the typical drill where you can pre-plan everything. Again, that's kind of the unplanned versus planned movements again. You get very different kind of results in those situations.
One last thing on shooting, because you spoke about this on a recent podcast about the jump shot and how we want repeatability and movement, but in particular variables such as release height and angle, and not the same exact repeated movement in the joints. So can you just talk about that a little bit? Because I think we think shooting is this thing that we should just have completely repeatable, exactly the same way every time, and then we'll have success. But that's not exactly true.
No, and it goes back to I start the book talking about the work of Nikolai Bernstein, who's this Russian scientist who studied, he studied blacksmiths, really, really experienced blacksmiths, and he measured the motion, and he found out the way that they hit this chisel the exact same spot every time is actually by using slightly different movements. And that's the fundamental idea that, to release the ball at the same angle and height every time requires slightly different movements of your body, because the conditions change, the constraints change. I start off a bit too much and I need to adjust. I get tired. There's a defender in the way. I'm playing outside, there's wind. So to produce the same outcome, and Bernstein's famous phrase is repetition without repetition. I repeat the outcome, but not by repeating the movement the exact same way every time. And it kind of throws into the face the idea of repetition. The idea I want to take 1,000,000 jump shots from the same spot and repeat it over and over, rote repetition. The idea that's the way to become skillful is really one of the things that a lot of people believe is what we really want to change. You need to learn how to produce the same outcome under different conditions and adjust it. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea.
And that's when you've learned,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes, for
Which
sure.
is the most important part. And talk to me just quickly. I'm going to ask you another question about shooting.
Sure.
Talk to me quickly then about this concept of form shooting, where we go out and we stand 2 feet from the basket and we repeat this form over and over again. And my point to most coaches is you never shoot like that when you're that close to the basket. It's a completely different movement pattern. So if we do any form shooting, arguably we should move it to 13 to 15 feet, where it's more likely that's how you're going to shoot. But talk to me about that whole concept.
Yeah, this is where, I would much rather, so usually it's very prescriptive kind of thing. So, right, you're telling the athlete, no, you need to get your elbows up, you need to snap your wrists. I would much rather if you really think that there's these fundamental invariants, again, these features that have to be there for effective shot, let's get those to kind of emerge from the constraints again, whether it's an analogy, so an instruction about kind of the classic one in basketball is reaching up and getting a cookie out of a cookie jar, right? So you're getting the movement you want without describing what you're doing with your elbows and your wrists and so on. So yeah, I think form, I'd ask, why do you want that? What's the purpose of that? And can we think of a constraint that will take away whatever the athlete's doing instead, right? So yeah, I think, and then the moving out distance is almost like the building the skill up again. We're when you're really close, you don't really need to put your lower body into it. So we're gonna, get you to learn that part. Then we're gonna put it all back together, which again, I don't think is the best way to do it.
No, it's not at all. And just as we move forward, and you've talked about the role of the coach in this type of coaching, but also just can you quickly touch on how the role of a coach changes as players become better with these perception and decision type of things that we want them to do in a game. How does my role change over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, it becomes more, I think about focusing on more specific things. I like kind of Carl Newell has a good model, and this is kind of Bernstein's idea too. When you start working with athletes, you're really just trying to get them like this general coordination solution. What's the basic structure of my jump shot going to be? And I think when you're working out with the athlete first place, that's what you want to get them. You want to get them to explore all over different, if they're in the wrong kind of, landscape is the term we like to use, versus when they get more and more skilled. I think you want to you're working on more optimization, right? You're getting them focus on specific things they need to adapt to. Maybe their shooting percentage is a bit lower in the fourth quarter. Let's get used to fatigue. So you're really doing much less getting them to explore these wide variations and really more focused variability around, specific things you want to work on. So that's kind of, I have a tease. I have a follow-up book planned eventually. Awesome. And that's one of the things I want to talk about in the book. How do we get to the point of more optimization when you have a more skilled athlete?
Coaches, how we learn to move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sports skills. And then, of course, perceptionaction.com and host of Perception Action podcast. And, Rob, if you will, with me, we'll put together a list and we can tweet it together. And maybe some of the podcasts where coaches could start as a starting point so that they, as you said, don't get intimidated by kind of the language and the depth. Mm-hmm. Because honestly, truthfully, I read this stuff, I know this stuff, and sometimes I get intimidated by the depth that you guys go into.
Me too, to be honest. Some of
which is a compliment.
The dynamical systems. Yeah, for sure.
I just want coaches to know that there's so much practical information from what you share. And this is a must-read book, and so many of your podcasts are must listen to. So thank you for sharing the game with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. That was a really fun conversation.